So what happens? What do we do when the 8 steps of positive prevention don't work? Why then we take the 8 steps to positive discipline. Unfortunately, for too many managers, their concept of discipline is to administer some kind of punishment, such as overtime, days off without pay, or the next 26 dirty jobs that come along. But the goal in discipline is to turn someone who is not following the proper path into a supportive and helpful disciple. The purpose of this segment of our discussion is to provide a philosophy and an operating procedure that will help get people back onto the performance path. I'm going to present an 8-step process for the positive discipline of problem employees, an overview of which you'll find in the progress guide. This action sequence will lead in stepwise fashion to the best solution and prevent a lot of random attempts at coping. Problem employee cases don't respond well to hit-or-miss approaches, but a manager can achieve control when he does this job by the numbers. The first step in positive discipline is to examine the performance of the problem employee. Actually, writing down a description of what the manager means by the performance discrepancy is an important beginning. Often supervisors will have a shorthand phrase to describe the employee's problem. One of the most notorious of these is the phrase, bad attitude. Describing exactly what he means by a bad attitude allows the manager to be a little more objective and a lot more specific about how the situation should be dealt with. Just what does the employee say or do that earns him this bad attitude label, or whatever other problem label may be attached? By the phrase bad attitude, the supervisor may mean that the employee in question has a negative influence on other employees, or perhaps bad attitude means that the employee uses vulgar language. It's impossible to manage an attitude. We can only manage behavior. Making guesses about people's motivation is neither very productive nor very defensible in a court of law. I'm willing to grant that people have bad attitudes and a negative mindset that is inappropriate at work, but we've got to be more specific and factual than that if we're going to get a handle on it. So in writing, describe exactly what the employee does, what the employee says, and the impact that it has on others. Writing it down also helps the manager's objectivity. Next, in performance analysis, a manager needs to identify the exact cost or value of the problem behaviors. The cost of the problem behavior may be both significant and intolerable, and may clearly indicate a need for correction. What are the costs that should be calculated? Some examples of the kinds of direct financial costs that should be considered include lost time or sick time payments, loss in productivity, cost of errors, workers' compensation payments and accident-related costs, impact on other workers' morale, and excessive time demands on the manager. In addition to describing the problem and calculating its costs, the manager should gather data. What specific evidence do we have? What testimony do we have? What reports are available? How much of this is direct observation as opposed to hearsay? So a file must be built. This file may or may not be directly used in building a case against the employee, but it is certainly important that the manager get his or her facts together. The last step I would suggest under performance analysis is for you, the manager, to take a good close look at your own performance. You might ask yourself these questions. Where have I failed? What have I left undone that I should have done? Is there a possibility that I contributed to this person's failings? Is there anything that I can do, even at this late date, that might turn this person around? Now, I don't think managers should get trapped by the paralysis of analysis, nor do I recommend a guilt trip. But I think it's going to be awfully difficult for the manager to confront the other person's failings if his own failings are just as bad. Step 2 in the process is to conduct some direct employee counseling sessions. While this might be handled through the annual performance review, counseling designed to manage problem employees is probably more focused than the annual performance review, more limited in terms of dealing with a specific problem area, and so a separate discussion is usually called for. In this employee counseling session, or series of sessions, an attempt should be made to give both positive and negative performance feedback. Some managers make the mistake of simply talking to problem employees about all the things they have done wrong and citing their areas of deficiency. What that does is create a feeling of defeat in these employees. What is more helpful is to spell out clearly what the person does very well, the positive side of the ledger, and what it is that causes you concern, the negative side of the ledger. In this way, problem employees have a better and more balanced picture of themselves and can see why you are troubled about the negative aspects of their performance, given the fact that there are so many positive aspects. In the course of providing this even-handed positive and negative performance feedback, there shouldn't be any game playing. And this session shouldn't be thought of as a highly sophisticated counseling process, just some candid communication. It could go something like this.
Judy, I respect your right to think and believe differently than I do about the way things should be done. I think it helps to have some diversity of opinion around here, and I know that not every good idea will come from me. But there's a point at which differences of opinion keep us from getting the job done. And at that point, I have to make a decision. At that point, things have to be done my way, because right or wrong, it's my responsibility.
I understand. What are you driving at?
Well, word has reached me that you are disagreeing with my decisions on the new computer procedures. And I've been hearing this from several sources. Is this the case?
Well, not exactly. Sure, I've said some things, but not to undermine you. Who said that anyway?
I don't want to reveal that, but you should know that people around here care about you. The purpose of this talk is not to tell you any conclusions I've reached about you, but to make it clear that I can't tolerate any confusion regarding the decisions I make. All employees on the team have to support the decisions that are made. If you or anyone else feels unable to do that, then the option is to leave the company. I certainly don't want you to do that because I value you and your contribution. But experience has taught me that any undercurrent that works against management's decisions can really damage an organization. I don't mean to sound judgmental or harsh, but I do want to be very clear about this. Before a decision on anything can be made, I want all the advice and opposing suggestions that people have to offer. But once things are in motion, I expect every employee to support the direction we're taking. Is that clear?
So what are you saying? Would you fire me?
I realize we're speaking hypothetically here, but I would have little choice. There's no one in this organization who wouldn't be replaced if he or she was behaving in an insubordinate manner. No one is bigger than the team, and no one who acts contrary to management direction and persuades others to do the same should think that he or she is immune from termination.
Well, that's okay, I guess, but it seems to me that what you're really doing is putting me in my place and telling me to shut my mouth.
No, I'm not. Anytime you think I'm out of line, I want you to come to me and tell me. You're welcome in here anytime, and frankly, I need to be told when I make mistakes. I won't react negatively to that. The only thing I ask is that people be straight with me. Tell me to my face, but with the others, keep your opinions to yourself and stick to doing the job you're paid to do. Is that fair enough?
I can live with that. I don't think you're always right. But as long as you're willing to hear me out, I'll keep my opinions to myself when the others are around.
Thank you, Judy. I really respect that. And I'm glad we had the chance to clear the air. I feel good about the way you've discussed this with me today.
In this feedback session, it's important that the manager overtly express displeasure over whatever is bothering him. If you will show the employee your anger, your frustration, your worry, and tell him straight out how the problem affects you and how it's affecting other people, I think that lets the employee see this exchange as something more than an intellectual exercise. But remember this important rule. Whenever you express displeasure, you must also express a feeling of confidence in the employee and their ability to get it together.
You know, I really don't understand why you're letting yourself get off track, Mary. I've been so pleased with everything else you've done. I can't imagine why you're letting yourself down like this. and also letting your coworkers down. That's just not you. I know you can do better than that.
So I think there's a balanced picture that you must present, involving not only positive and negative information, but positive and negative emotion. One last suggestion in terms of these employee counseling sessions. I wouldn't make them extremely confrontational, and I would not make them overly long. I'd keep them fairly short and to the point, and let this become part of your normal supervisory communication style. Basically, they are word-to-the-wise sessions. Just a word should do the trick. To the wise implies that if they're smart enough, your problem employees will clean up their act on their own. All they need, if they're really good people, aware people, is that succinct, candid message. Realize, too, that this short counseling technique has its limits. I'd give it 2 or 3 tries, but I wouldn't give it 10. The wise will hear you, the others won't, and for them there are the other steps in the positive discipline procedure. The third step in the positive discipline sequence is to start documenting like crazy. If the initial counseling sessions and the second step have not paid off, if the employee has not responded, then it's very clear that his behavior is not just a temporary deviation. At this stage, you have to face the unpleasant prospect that this case may eventually require some very strong medicine, perhaps termination, and that in turn could even lead to a lawsuit. This is why it's so important that you start to document, for example, by keeping records and by dictating reports of how your conferences went. Because of my belief that people respond best to honesty, I would let the employee know that this information is being kept.
I've talked with you, Dan, in several sessions now about the quality of your work. I've told you exactly how I feel, and you just don't seem to be following through. As part of the normal process in these cases, I'm now starting to keep a record of your performance. I'm going to have to put in time to keep track of this thing. Isn't this sad? Since I believe in letting people know where they stand, I just wanted you to know that I'm keeping this record.
Now, advising the employee is going to have several effects. First, it communicates to Dan that you're serious. It also communicates to Dan that if disciplinary action follows at some future point, he might want to react then in some other way than by getting angry. You see, one of the things Dan now knows is that you've got a big fat file on him. And I think that has a positive psychological effect. It lets the employee know that you probably have solid evidence about his performance and that you're not going to be fooled at some later time. The benefit of this is that it helps Dan to grasp the fact that things are becoming serious. It also lets him know that you're preparing for further action. This may jar Dan into getting his performance back on track. If it doesn't, it still provides a base for you to stand on when stricter measures must be taken. In that file, you are to put facts only. Avoid writing down opinions or conjecture or hearsay. What we are interested in is what you know, what you saw, what others report based on their direct observation. Don't state in the record that you think he's having a midlife crisis or she must be menopausal. Stay away from such subjective, ignorant, and potentially damaging comments. Instead, simply report the facts of the employee's behavior, what it is that the employee has or has not done. Sometimes the question arises as to whose records these are. Occasionally an employee will want to see his record. Generally, the courts have ruled that these are not the employee's records, but the employer's. However, there is no guarantee that any particular judge would hold to that view, especially in these days of full disclosure and freedom of information thinking. So while this is the employer's record of dealings with an employee, it is always good judgment to enter into that record facts only. In the event that your handling the situation later becomes a basis for legal action, the record will never embarrass you if it's founded on solid evidence. The next step in positive discipline is to perform a complete review of the situation. At this point, you have assessed what is wrong with the employee's performance, calculated its cost to you, and had some initial and apparently unsuccessful employee counseling sessions. And most recently, you've opened a file and compiled all of the relevant documentation. Now it's time to sit down and consider the entire case. It is at this juncture that your organization's discipline policy needs to be reviewed and thoroughly understood. If you're in a very small organization, it's possible that there may be no written discipline policy now. My suggestion is that you use the specific case you're working on now to create at least the beginnings of such a policy. Write down exactly the steps you feel are fair and that you've gone through, and use that as the first draft of a policy statement, which might be expanded later, and then have that statement reviewed by your legal counsel. The purpose of policy is to give you a clear roadmap or at least establish some general guidelines. Disciplinary situations sometimes get emotional and complicated. Management must agree on a uniform series of steps that are to be taken. And in part, policy helps guide decision-making. It represents evidence of due process that would be important in building a legal case should that become necessary. The courts have generally ruled that a policy that is not enforced is a non-policy, and that the practices that are followed become the de facto, the actual policy. That is, the pattern of those deviations from policy will generally be ruled by the court to be the true policy followed by your organization. For this reason, it becomes very important that management strictly enforce the policy in order to protect the organization. After reviewing the discipline policy, a full discussion with Human Resources Management is called for. At this time, you're ready for a review of the specifics of the case, and it's often helpful to sit down with someone more experienced, go through the situation step by step, and let that person test whether you have done what needs to be done in disciplinary cases. Another element of the situation review is to develop your action plan. What are you now going to do with Tom or Mary? What would be the first thing you would do? The second? When will you do it? What kinds of support elements will need to be in place, and so on. At this point, you've thoroughly reviewed the situation, and now the time has come to act, and act expeditiously. The next step in the positive discipline process is to take whatever action you've decided on. In no particular order of priority, here are some corrective measures that might be included in an action agenda.
Corrective measure number 1. Provide education and training.
Under this approach, you might do some special on-the-job training or specific coaching. Or you might pair this person under a buddy system with an effective worker who could serve as a good role model. Education and training are an appropriate course of action when you determine that the person does not know how to do the task, or there's some question about the person's knowledge of how to perform the task, or the person hasn't performed the task in some time. However, education and training are not a reasonable course of action when you're dealing primarily with a motivational or attitudinal problem.
Corrective measure number 2. Provide counseling.
Sometimes the manager is the counseling source the person comes to. Just by listening and talking and being there for others, the manager can help some people deal with their problems. Psychological counseling is another way to help people get back on track. The manager has to be able to identify those cases that he can't handle. If simple, friendly talk doesn't help, professional advice is in order. Referring the person either to an in-house specialist or to an outside community resource may be the best course of action.
Corrective measure number 3. Utilize an employee assistance program if one exists.
These programs have become increasingly popular in recent years. A number of companies have started to group specific programs such as health promotion, counseling, benefits planning, and others into an overall employee assistance program. And if your organization has an EAP, you might discuss your current problem case with the program's administrator. Together you can assess the employee's needs and the organization's resources, then plan a coordinated approach to problem solving.
Corrective measure number 4. Issue specific warnings.
Under some discipline policies, a set number of warnings, either verbal or in writing, are given, usually following the rule of 3 times and out. In issuing a warning, management takes the view that there's nothing it can do to solve the employee's problem. The employee is going to have to solve his own problem. Meanwhile, management is making it abundantly clear that it's not going to tolerate this performance past a certain point, and that the employee is now on thin ice.
Corrective measure number 5. Employ social censure.
In some cases, the work group does this for you by not inviting the offending party to social events, lunch, after-work get-togethers, and so forth. Sometimes a supervisor might censure a subordinate socially by not smiling at the person or by frowning, even though the supervisor might smile at everyone in the group except Tom. The decision to employ social censure is certainly a personal values question, and some supervisors won't be comfortable with this approach. But it is a powerful, forceful way of getting the message across. I think the real question is, how well do you know your people? It was said of Vince Lombardi that one of the reasons he was so successful was that he knew whom to pat on the back and whom to kick in the pants, dealing with each member of his team in a way that worked for that particular individual.
Corrective measure number 6. Reduce rewards.
I said previously that I don't like layoffs, which in essence reduce a person's take-home pay for the days not worked. The reason I dislike layoffs is that this approach says to the problem employee that the only way we can solve your performance problem on the job is to send you off the job. I think that inviting people to leave the premises isn't really dealing with their central need to adapt better at work. I guess I'd rather have them on the job and working on their problem than home watching television and being rewarded with entertainment. But there are more productive ways in which rewards can be manipulated to influence employee performance. For example, holding up merit increases or reducing other financial or non-financial rewards. Don't confuse the issue in people's minds by providing pay for reasons other than merit or incentive. Some organizations think the choice at review time should be between getting a salary increase and getting no increase. But a better viewpoint is that salary review time is a chance to determine whether you get a salary increase or a salary decrease. I agree with this approach. The option should be that you could get more or you could get less. That may seem a little extreme, but I would submit that some people are worth less than they were a year ago, and that to continue to reward them at the level of their former performance is overpayment. A modification of that position is to have the job regraded, classifying it downward, based on the person's not performing tasks at a higher level. People generally react very strongly to tampering with the reward structure, which indicates its strength as a possible tactic. As a matter of practicality, most managers will simply approve the annual merit increase, finding that to be the easiest course of action. But doing so sends a signal that one can get away with coasting in this organization, and that just reinforces the unwanted behavior.
Corrective measure number 7. Administer direct punishment.
There are those who would consider punishing people to be another item on the action agenda. But punishment is contrary to my main point. We're trying to positively discipline people rather than punish them. The major problem behavior modification specialists report with punishment is that its effects are not very predictable. That is, a person who is punished may simply rebel as opposed to changing his behavior. It's uncertain what type of response you'll get. The goal here is not a fight, but a change of behavior.
Corrective measure number 8. Offer support.
Often the manager's action agenda is to provide continuing support by way of communication, taking the person under his wing. He provides a high level of consideration and caring in the relationship. Often, the good supervisor or co-worker who is sensitive to the needs of the troubled person can take a performance deficiency and turn it into a performance strength. I think providing supportive help and making a commitment to the person in difficulty can be powerful and appropriate actions to take. There may be other action agendas that can be pursued. I think you have to use some creativity in designing your agenda on a case-by-case basis. There is no single path, no magic way, and managers have to devise strategies that will work with each individual. If you have not already done so, take a look at the action plan for problem employee managing in the Progress Guide. This lists many actions that could be taken, and I recommend that a separate action plan be created for each problem case you're working on. Extra copies can be ordered if needed. Once the action agenda has been decided on and implemented, then it's important to monitor the problem employee's progress, or lack of it, on an ongoing basis. Generally, the person is in sufficient difficulty at this point that daily or weekly reviews of his or her performance are called for. I really can't see reviewing their performance on a monthly basis. Sometimes you'll see employees who get called into the office and receive a warning, but then the boss doesn't follow up and check where they stand in the coming 30 days. I don't believe benign neglect solves the problem. I think that part of the action agenda, or certainly an outgrowth of the action agenda, has to be compliance monitoring. How is the employee doing day by day and week by week? As they say in the factories, the workers perform only what the boss inspects. An active inspection is what is called for at this time. Among other things, it will help maintain a certain psychological pressure and establish the closeness of the supervisor to the supervised. The employee may now respond favorably to your action agenda. He gets it together, and that's the end of the problem. But there's the other possibility, yet another failure. At this point, you have to decide how many more chances you want to give this person. Often, you have to recycle the process, going back to the action agendas, repeating potentially effective tactics, and then monitoring, trying different things. I think there is a virtue in testing different approaches, but there comes a time when I would suggest that you've got to start facing up to some hard realities, namely the action agendas that you've been able to devise, can afford, or are in the range of what you are willing to undertake, may not be enough to get the desired result. How many times you want to return to the action list and try different approaches is strictly a judgment call. Some managers are inclined to give problem employees 1 or 2 chances only. Other managers may be willing to give them 2 or 3, or even considerably more. My own judgment is that in most cases, if your efforts haven't succeeded after 3 attempts, they're not going to succeed at all. That brings us to the final warning. Under most discipline policies, a final warning is called for, unless the misbehavior calls for immediate dismissal. This is the point in the relationship with the employee at which he gets an ultimatum. This individual must now either turn his performance around or be shown the door. Substantially more will be said about final warnings later. I'll introduce you then to a 7-step process known as power counseling that can be effective in saving a remarkable number of people at this late stage. The bare bones of the final warning are an announcement, usually verbal, that spells out what behavior has to change, by what date, and what the consequences will be if it doesn't change. Because this is the final warning, the consequence is nearly always termination. Generally, this is not a discussion, although some discussion could be appropriate. But remember, this is not a negotiation session, but a warning that the employee is teetering on the brink. If the situation doesn't call for the power counseling approach as a last-ditch effort to save the employee, then this final warning announcement is the minimum action required to back management up if legal proceedings subsequently result. One other point to keep in mind is that certain offenses may warrant termination without warning. These are acts so serious or grievous that they require immediate termination. These differ from place to place based on the judgment of management, but may include theft, gross insubordination, use of alcohol or drugs on the job, knowingly engaging in unsafe practices, and sabotage of company operations. How do you proceed with termination or resignation? If the final warning discussion does not work, then the last step in the positive discipline of problem employees is to proceed with termination or give them the opportunity to resign. Even termination can be handled in a positive way, and I'll provide some more detailed and specific guidance for how to deal with that later in the program. The positive discipline of problem employees, then, is an 8-step sequence. First, analyze the performance deficiency and its cost to you. Second, provide initial employee counseling sessions that give people feedback regarding their performance. Third, maintain extensive documentation to prepare you in the event of further, more serious action. Fourth, do a complete review of the situation in order to create the fifth step, an agenda of specific actions that you're going to take with this person. Sixth, monitor that agenda for compliance. Seventh, have the final warning conversation. And finally, step 8 is the termination or resignation process. Our goal is discipleship, not punishment. Since we're after satisfactory performance and winning behavior, we don't need to feel uncomfortable or emotionally over-involved about moving through a series of increasingly serious measures.